We'll wait for us to, the voice is there. Okay, excellent. Okay, so good morning, good Friday morning. I know that there are some technical difficulties beaming in this morning and finding us. Luckily, this is being recorded, so we will, and I certainly will, ideally, hopefully, if it merits it, wax enthusiastic about what we do today. We will be talking about political cartoons, and as you'll see, I use technology. I'm not good at technology. So at any rate, it'll be an interesting, different episode that I'm eager to try out. And Newbie is really excited about this. I don't know why. However, before, I just saw someone say what episode it is. 97? Is that it? 97? 96. Okay.
96.
96th episode. I know I say that like every week and I go like, wow, but that's a huge number. That we have been here for a long time. But before we plunge into political cartoons, I will turn to Grace, who can explain the rules of the game.
Wonderful. And Joanne, may I announce what we emailed about last night? Because I know there's been some eager chatter about this. Okay. Yes. Good morning, everyone. Our apologies that our website is down. We are frantically working on that at the back end. We'll keep working. But my name is Grace Leatherman. I'm the Executive Director of the National Council for History Education. We are thrilled to be with you here this morning. We're very grateful to Joanne for doing this wonderful History Matters, and so does coffee yet again. This is the 96th episode. Yes, on our 100th episode coming up, we will have an extra special episode here at 10 o'clock. But we also want to let you know that on March 19th at 8 o'clock, we're going to have History Matters and So Do Cocktails. That will be in the evening after our conference programming, but it will be open to the public. And we hope that you can just gather with us and celebrate Joanne and this wonderful show. So that is very, very exciting. We hope you can join us. Bring your martinis. And yes, we will imbibe and talk history. So yes, mark your calendars.
And how fun is that? I mean, come on. History Matters and So Do Cocktails. That's a true statement. And chatting about history with a cocktail in your hand, it's a fine thing. So I hope lots of people come. Not necessarily.
It's a solid party. Be there.
Yeah, it is. Be there because it'll be fun and it'll be wonderful to celebrate talking history for 100 weeks.
Indeed. And it is March 19th at 8 o'clock Eastern, but we will put out all kinds of announcements about that too. So don't worry, you will know where to get there. And you can also find it on our conversations page when it comes back up. So this morning, please engage in the chat with each other. You're wonderful about discussing history as we go, but also make sure if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. Please, of course, as usual, keep it family friendly. You always do, but we have lots of folks beaming into this show. And with that, I am going to hand it over to Joanne to talk to us about cartoons as politics.
Hey, so I thought of this topic yesterday. I know I should have thought of it sooner. I thought of it yesterday and was trying to think of things that I would say. And at a remarkably late point in the game, 9:15 this morning, we begin at 10. It occurred to me that, I know this is going to sound very silly, this needs visuals. I'm talking about cartoons. We really need to see some cartoons. So, as you will see, I am going to be trying in a few moments screen sharing and a PowerPoint presentation. Now, I will say, this is the first PowerPoint presentation I have ever done. In my lectures, I really like to just speak and tell stories and engage people that way. And I don't like to have technology in the way. So I might be the only human being on earth who has not used a PowerPoint presentation before. And I'm, like I said, I'm okay with technology, but not, and Newbie just whistled charge, and I appreciate that, Newbie, thank you. I'm not horrible with technology, but I need a little time to catch up. And I did this in a remarkably short amount of time this morning. Now I'm saying all this because then if it doesn't work, you can excuse me, but I think it will. So what I want to talk about is political cartoons. Obviously, I cannot take a full march over all of American history talking about political cartoons. So as you'll see in a moment, I've captured a few of them, to talk about a number of different ways and different things that political cartoons, how they operated, what they accomplished. Obviously, and this is an obvious fact, but it's worth stating, what's powerful about cartoons is not only that they can be satirical, they can caricature people, they can really be cutting, and yet because they're a cartoon and seemingly humorous, they can get away with a lot, but they're images. And in some periods of time, for example, early America, that's not an image-rich moment. And by that, I mean, yes, you could see paintings and you could see portraits, but obviously no television, no, magazines with very small circulations and little engravings in them. They weren't floating in imagery. So a cartoon could have a bigger impact that way as well. So cartoons, generally speaking, and I'm going to speak very broadly here because this is not my area of expertise by far. Apparently, 17th century Italy is where cartoons of the sort that we might recognize as cartoons or caricatures began. England really came into its own in this form, in English satire, in the mid 18th century. And the first cartoon or so that we're going to see here will be very obviously British. They mastered the art. British sarcasm, British satire. Actually, there's two British cartoons. You will recognize both of them. That was powerful. Americans, it took them a little while and to begin to create, logically enough, an American version of the cartoon. And then after a while, technology helped with the evolution of it because you could suddenly print mass quantities of things that you couldn't have done that way before. Now, initially, it's worth noting that cartoons were actually sold as like in the late 18th century in the United States. They were sold as broadsheets, single sheets in the street. So you could buy a cartoon that way. They weren't necessarily attached to a publication at all. And part of the reason we know this, and I meant to get this from Founders Online so I could read it, which I did not do, but I can relate the story. Because as soon as I said I'm going to talk about cartoons, I thought about this anecdote, which I think I've used before here, which is why I ultimately kind of left it till last in my preparation. There's a really famous episode, I believe it's in 1792 or 1791, now I can't remember which Jefferson takes notes on. And you guys, I guess I can't read while I'm talking here, but it happens to be regarding an incident in which Henry Knox, who's the Secretary of War, apparently buys a cartoon on the street. Oh, so it must be 1793, actually, now that I'm getting into the cartoon. And it shows Washington being marched up onto a guillotine. And it's about being monarchical. It's kind of bathed in the French Revolution. And Henry Knox, who's sort of a jovial guy, shows up to a cabinet meeting and says basically, hey, look what I found on the street. And Washington throws a fit. And we know this because Jefferson recorded it. And I can't do justice to what Washington says, but he rants for quite a while. And I think this is part of what he rants, right? He says, they're accusing me of wanting to be emperor of the world. I haven't wanted to be president. As a matter of fact, I've regretted being president from one moment, and that's every moment since the time I took this position. I mean, he really goes like red-faced rant, how dare they accuse me of this? I don't want to be here. I want to go home. I don't want all this power. What are they doing? Not only that, but they send me copies of the newspapers that insult me and the cartoons so that I can see them? Really? They're sending me things that are insulting me. So he has this enormous rant. And what I love about this, it's one of my favorite anecdotes, is that after recording, Jefferson records this huge rant. And then at the end, Jefferson writes, there was a pause. Some difficulty resuming our conversation. And I adore that because you have Washington really throwing a fit. And then Jefferson records that. You can totally feel it and hear it, that obvious moment when he stops and there's like a silence. People are like, now what do we do? So that's a response to a political cartoon, the power of a political cartoon. They predate that point, and I'm going to show you an example of, I think I will. Okay, host disabled participant screen sharing. This is not helping me. So you need to allow me to screen share, Grace. I'll keep talking while you are figuring out how to do that. So as we'll see, the cartoons that I'm going to show are sort of range over. Grace, yes, Grace does need to enable this for me to be able to share the screen. I hope she's still there listening, or if John's listening, someone. This would be the alternate.
I'm here.
Oh, okay, good. I don't know what you do to do that, but you do indeed need to do that because, oh, there we go. Thank you.
Good.
Okay, look at that. Okay, and you guys, so can you see this?
We can.
Sharing?
Yep.
Woohoo! Okay. Oh my gosh. This is very exciting to me. Okay, so this is an early example. This is very clearly a British cartoon using the cartoon format to really be able to smack at the colonists and say things that they might not want to say in print, or that they might not put in this robust a manner in print. And the title of it is "The Bostonians Paying the Excise Man." And clearly they're paying him by tarring and feathering him and pouring tea down his throat. Behind them, you can see it is a liberty tree with a noose hanging from it. And off to the left, they're throwing tea into the harbor. So this is a British cartoon mocking what the colonists are doing. And you can see it's a sophisticated image, but it makes its point really well. And I'll bet a lot of you have seen this image before. So during the Revolution, there was a good tradition of cartooning. And as I said, many of them British. And I actually have facts and figures here that to give you a sense of the number of cartoons between 1730 and 1760 in the United States, there were about 3,000 different cartoons. Between 1770 and 1800, there were 6,000. In the years leading up to the American Revolution, between 6 and 10 appeared each week. So we are out of contact with this, but there were a lot of these, and we all know the same few, right? Like America being depicted as a Native American wearing a, we can, I'm sure, think of all of the same cartoons that appear in textbooks, but there are many more. And the thing about cartoons in this period, and I will show you an example of this. The thing about cartoons in this period is, although they're images, they are very word centric. And so if you are looking at a late 18th or early or even up to mid 19th century cartoon, very often you end up with these sorts of cartoons with masses of words coming out of people's mouths in bubbles that are actually potentially really hard to read. I could not find a big image of this. And this was a cartoon I love, so I wanted to use it, but I don't have the wording of it. Let me see if I got a little bit of it, because I did, I think, copy a little bit of it. Oh, okay. So this is a cartoon of, as you can see, it says on the bottom, a duel between Republican DeWitt Clinton and Burrite John Swartwout. And this was an unusual duel because, and these men did not like each other. The seconds in the case of this duel did an unusual thing, although we assume that it's the way duels typically worked. We have an image from Hollywood that, people sort of walk away from each other and then spin and fire. No, people would be standing and facing each other and there would be a countdown. So in this case, for some reason, the seconds did the spin and fire thing. And I believe it's Clinton, or I can't remember now if it's Clinton or Swartwout. And there's a letter in which he's like, what? What did you do? Like, this is insane, right? That and there are all kinds of accounts of, shots flying wild. And what happens is in a duel, the person who feels insulted after a shot is fired, is asked, is honor satisfied? And he has the right to say, no, it is not, in which case you have to exchange fire again. So in this case, fire is exchanged 5 times. And at the end of the 5th time, let's see here. I want to be sure I got the right guy. I don't want to blame somebody. At the end of the fifth shot, I'm looking at this is bad. The fates are going to get me now because I can't remember if it's Clinton or Swartwout. But basically, at the end of the fifth shot, one of them says to the other, I'm done. Like we've exchanged fire 5 times. I know you say honor is not satisfied, but this is ridiculous. Like 5 shots, we very clearly have proven our honor, and I'm leaving. Actually, I think it's Swartwout on the right, so perhaps it is he who says it. This is a cartoon making fun of him for leaving at that 5th shot. And what you're seeing here, and it's kind of hard for me to believe it. This is in my first book because it struck me as quite something to see in a cartoon. This is Swartwout's second, assuming I'm correct about which person that is. And he has his wig underneath Swartwout's nether regions. And he is saying, damn this liquid honor. My wig is full of it. So basically, it's accusing this poor guy of cowardice, and he's having an accident, a cowardly accident of loose bowels. And this is what we are seeing here. This is about as crude, I mean, not as crude as you can get, but pretty crude. When I found this and I put it in my first book, I remember that the person at the press who I revealed it to, laughed for a very long time about, damn this liquid honor. My wig is full of it. So this is very typical of late 18th century, early 19th century cartoons with all of the words. And sometimes you could figure out from the images what's being said. Sometimes you honestly have to read and know the details. So part of what these cartoons show is the degree to which some people at least, were pretty well informed about what was going on so that they would understand what the heck these cartoons meant. Now, this one is just mocking someone as being a coward, and it's person from one branch of a party mocking someone from another branch of a party. This, and I do not have the title. Okay, I'm not perfect. But I can tell you exactly what this is. This is a cartoon that represents, with a real cutting edge to it, President Andrew Jackson's Indian removal policy. And it's depicting him as, the great father, and he's cradling Native Americans in his arms. And this is a cartoon that's commenting on the fact that he's the precise opposite of this. So it's actually, although the image itself isn't frightening, the implications of it are pretty cutting. And as I said, I did not click to add title, but you can see the power of this, and you can see it has hard edges. Although it's meant to be humorous in some ways, it's really more meant to make a political point. And that's the thing about cartoons. They can mock people or make fun of people or smack at political opponents to bring them down, but they can make pretty cutting social commentary. They can expose corruption. There are any number of things cartoons can do, and they can get away with a lot of it because some of it is just in images, which just isn't the right word, but things that are not in words but are in images, there's more wiggle room there. So that's some of what we see with political cartoons. Now here, we have members of Congress debating the Kansas question. There was a mass brawl in 1858 when they were debating the issue of slavery in Kansas. And indeed, it was massive. It was one of the brawls in which great numbers of congressmen are brawling with each other. And what you can see here on the floor, there are spectacles, and there's sort of some kind of blob. That's actually one congressman's toupee, which was wiped off of his head. I think the bald gentleman on the right side of the screen probably was wearing the toupee. At any rate, this is making fun of Congress, right? And that's particularly clear because of the very obvious title of this: members of Congress debating the Kansas question. Very straightforward. And this basically really happened. So this is mocking Congress. And again, there were a lot of cartoons and articles and jokes. There was a lot of humor in the late 1850s smacking at Congress, which is interesting. So for a while, because Congress didn't seem to be able to solve the problem of slavery, there was a lot of smacking at Congress for being unable to do its job. After a time, there was a lot less humor, and they were beginning to realize that this was very serious. But still, you can see what this cartoon is accomplishing. Now, the next cartoon I want to show you, I will ask you to not reproduce it because I had to pay a lot of money to use this in my most recent book, and I had to sign forms. So you are not allowed to wildly use this all over the place. Probably for teaching, I would guess it's okay, but not to republish it. But at any rate, I want to show you, it is a British cartoon, and it's pretty broad in its humor, aimed at a British audience, as you will see, making commentary on American society and politics in a way that might be familiar. It's titled Life in an American Hotel, and it shows a member of Congress pointing a gun at someone sitting across the table and saying, pass the mustard. Okay, now, first of all, this is about Americans and guns, right? This is a British cartoon from 1856 about those crazy Americans and their guns. But this refers to a specific episode that took place that year. And it's the year that Sumner's came, but this took place at that same time, in which a member of Congress went to the Willard Hotel for breakfast. It was late. The waiter informed him that it was past the time when breakfast could be served. The member of Congress, Philemon Herbert, I believe is his name, from California, got very angry at the waiter, an Irish waiter, so he looked down on him as well, for telling him he couldn't have the breakfast he wanted at the time he wanted. So he pulled a gun, and people began lifting chairs to fend him off. And there was a crazy moment in the restaurant of the Willard Hotel. And ultimately, Herbert killed the waiter for not serving him breakfast. And so this is a cartoon making fun of something that in a sense is really not funny, but it's so extreme that how can you be in England and not say, here you go, folks, the United States of America. And basically this just happened. So there's a humor in the extremity of it, right? In the excess of it. So what I like about this cartoon, if you think back to the ones with the words coming out of everyone's mouth, this is very straightforward. It's from Punch magazine from 1856. Very clear message. I actually don't know how far it spread in the United States, but a British audience would have understood what was being said. And Herbert actually gets brought to court for murdering the waiter. And he goes to court accompanied by a platoon of other members of Congress, and he is not found guilty because that's the way it goes, long tradition. So that's one extreme cartoon. I have one more cartoon, actually two more, but they're together, that I want to show you because I realize I'm running out of time. They're a different form of cartoon. They represent caricature, not necessarily biting, but saying a lot with a brief image. This is from Harpers Weekly in 1858. And there was a page, and I'm going to show you in a minute. I actually own this newspaper. This is why I said at some point earlier on, there's show and tell here. There's a series of these caricatures of members of Congress. And as you can see, the fellow on the right is basically sleeping or napping, and the title is a vigilant guardian of his constituents' interests. And on the left is member from the South with his feet up on the desk, reading something and not paying attention to what's going on around him at all. So these are very clear caricatures of kinds of congressmen which are making their point, which anyone looking at these images would have understood. But they're not as painful as some of the other ones. Even so, they are making a point, and they would have been in this case. This is from a newspaper. Very careful here. Yeah. Okay. It's big. Okay. So this is the newspaper. I want to show you how big it is. Harpers Weekly, with Alexander Stevens on the front. And here is a kind of vaguely comical article. Basically, someone from Turkey looking at Washington for the first time and describing what he sees. So it's justifying the caricatures. Let's see if I can do this right. Hang on, damaging the newspaper. You can see some of the images here, different kinds of congressmen of various kinds. There's a Kansas question debater in the corner there. A lot of images, and Harper's was famous for that, for its engraving being in the newspaper. So as a matter of fact, as a historian, when you're writing about this time period, some part of me is always like, Harper's must have done something. And usually on the last page of Harper's, there would be a cartoon page. Again, cutting, maybe more cutting than these caricatures of members of Congress, but still, again and again and again, making the point of smacking at politicians, smacking at people with power in some way. Now, when I tweeted the topic of this episode, and I was thinking to myself, what would the modern comparison be? Because I thought, well, yeah, we have cartoons and in newspapers, and they circulate on social media. I can think of several that if I said something about the face eating leopard party or something like that, you would all know the cartoon I refer to because it's all over Twitter all the time. So, but I think maybe a better example of our current version of political cartoons, and by that I mean sort of floating around everywhere, short term, don't necessarily, last forever, are not always works of art necessarily, but are trying to make often a really cutting point. Maybe New Yorker cartoons count, but what I was thinking of was memes on social media. Some of them are beyond crude, but some of them are very clever, and there's an image or a cartoon or something funny, but what they're doing is making a pretty severe, a pretty strong point. Sometimes it's a severe, strong point that makes you want to punch the screen of your computer because you disagree with it, or because it's crude or really, really wrong-headed. But to me, it seems like the spirit behind some of those political memes feels as though it's more in line with something like this, or like this. Things that are, even in their own time, were a little crude. Seeing a highfalutin politician in New York defecating, we could see a meme having some modern equivalent of that. So I think memes are the equivalent of that. And I think, again, a reason for that is they circulate all over the place. Everyone can get access to them. And they're images, and they're images of a sort we don't get in our newspapers or in books, or they're very particular kinds of images. And social media is certainly not new, but it's new enough that what's happening on there still attracts our attention. And there are still things that happen on there that are new, even not just a new meme, but a new way of using social media that we glom on and we look at it. So I think in one way or another, the edginess and often the crudeness and the anger and the critical commentary of some memes might be the modern equivalent of these cartoons. And what's interesting about that, and what might be interesting for you as you go and look, if indeed you dare, on social media at some of these memes, politically minded memes, you might think about, again, as we've talked about before, what they're suggesting, not whatever crude point they're making in one way or another, but what they're suggesting about the feeling and the assumption underlying it. What are those people or person who created it assuming that their audience member needs to know and feel to get in on the joke? Or what are they trying to instill in someone who looks at it? Because images are a powerful way of getting people's attention and getting their support. So it might be worth looking at memes not just as goofy, crude things that another one. It might be, in the case of political ones, worth thinking about the intent, the intended audience, the message and the impact that the person making it wants, and what that tells you about this moment in political time and about the people who created that meme. Okay, I am going to stop screen sharing. I did it. I did it, my first PowerPoint. Okay, so that is my very brief, quick and dirty commentary on political cartoons with my very first PowerPoint. But I want to open things up, as always, for questions, but mug, I almost did indeed miss the mug. So this one, it's not intended to be cutting. It's just offered maybe with a little caricature and humor and kindness. It's from Carolee. It's The Many Brains of Dr. Joanne Freeman. And I've talked about them on here a lot. It's like non-historian citizen brain, popular culture brain, fresca brain, jingle brain, newbie brain, founder's brain, coat brain. I think that counts as a kind of cartoonish image. And I am honored that I have one that I could find and pull forth from my cupboard and actually have something relevant to show. So thank you, Carolee. A Carolee brain. It needs to be a different brain added on here. But indeed, that is the mug. And Grace, what is behind you?
I'm muted, of course. I have a Federalist, Anti-Federalists cartoon from Connecticut in 1787. And this is one I used with my students, but I do have my head placed a certain way. I didn't feel like you needed to look at this guy the entire time. There are some very earthy imagery in 18th century cartoons. So that is something. When you said you were going to do this, I thought, yeah, that's my students were always very, very interested in those cartoons.
Well, right. There's and actually this cartoon, the point of this cartoon, is this the one about moving the capital?
No. So this is, let's see. I believe that's I haven't taught this in a really long time, but I believe
okay.
so that's the Federalists in the wagon back there, and it's full of paper money, and they're pulling it in two directions. And I believe the gentleman with the issue behind my head there is William Williams, the anti-federalist. And
there's another one that is framed in a similar way that has to do with the moving of the capital, and it's the same kind with 1,000 balloons of words coming out of people's heads. But that's excellent. Not just a cartoon, Grace, but an early American cartoon. That is excellent.
Highly a lot happening there.
There is a lot happening there. Okay, I want to open things up. I have to mention one other cartoon, just because I don't have a copy here. I couldn't use it. I could have found it, but I didn't have time. I haven't used it in class yet because, as you just said, Grace, this is why it came to mind. It's a little earthy, but whoever did it is clever. It is around the time when the treaty ending the American Revolution was being negotiated. And the title of the cartoon is The Piss of Paris, PISS. And what you see is a big bucket and a number of men standing around it, peeing into it. And they are each saying something appropriate to that moment. And they are caricatured. So there's a Native American figure saying something like, "I believe this is a very free and independent piss." And there's, a Frenchman and there's a British person there. And it is, to me, extremely funny, but I haven't used it in class yet because it's a group of men standing around a bucket peeing into it.
And here you are live on Facebook discussing it.
I know, but here
we are.
The opposite of cartoons. There's no image. So I can mention this, but it would be more powerful and potentially alarming to some if I had found the image. If you want to use it in class, I'm sure you could look up The Piss of Paris and find it. It says a lot in many, many ways. Okay, I'll shut up now because I'm blathering about our time and I want to have people have time for.
True, Clinton. Everyone does have lots of comments in the chat. Do make sure you put them in the Q&A as well so that we can share some of these questions. And of course, some of you are educators. If there are cartoons you use with your students, tell us how that goes.
Carolee, did you just find The Piss of Paris? Did you just make a link to it? I'm sorry, I just saw you do a link and I was like, oh, come on. I'm sorry, go ahead, Grace.
Do keep an eye on the chat because we do have apparently earthy cartoons being linked to. So there you go. All right. Miranda wants to know, who was the most caricatured president, or let's just put that, who is a highly caricatured president in your view?
Well, I mean, speaking off the top of my head, there are a lot of Jefferson images and cartoon images of Jefferson. There's a famous one that's referring in one way or another to Sally Hemings. There's one about him and the embargo. There's one about him and negotiating or actually being held up regarding the Louisiana Purchase. There's one about him and the French Revolution. So there are a good number of cartoons about him. And I think, and this is also off the top of my head, I think this is partly because the Federalists, in a really British tradition, were really good at satire. They were writing satirical poems in this period. They were smacking at people with a really bitter edge. And it makes perfect sense to me that when Jefferson becomes president, that the Federalists are right there making really cutting cartoons, and often, very detailed cartoons, which certainly Jefferson is very recognizable. So they're putting a lot of energy and talent into those cartoons. So I think that's one big reason. Someone says Heather is putting her fist into the air. Indeed. I think that's one big reason why he particularly, he was so hated, and it was the first non-Federalist president that he attracted that kind of commentary from very biting, satirical, angry Federalists.
All right, thank you. And just to note that Tim did find the link in question, and it is at the Library of Congress.
Okay. Of
All
course,
kinds of good stuff.
You guys are amazing. You guys are. I have. I will, during the after party, I will mention another very frequent cartoon image, which I will not mention here for the broad audience, but that I found at the Library of Congress, because indeed, ripe and robust humor of the 18th century. They weren't shy. Anyway, I'm sorry, more questions.
Oh no, and again, there are such treasures in the Library of Congress. Well, and so along that's a president who is frequently caricatured. In the course of your research, because again, you focused on the 18th century and the 19th century, is there kind of a waxing and waning of the extent to which cartoons are used? Is it something that's just always a strong tool? Are there moments when you see more cartoons than others?
Well, I mean, speaking in a really general way, part of what happens is technology changes and it becomes much easier to create and publish cartoons. And so they become much more sophisticated after a certain point, and that becomes apparent when you look at these cartoons. So for that reason, I think there are more of them around and they're easier to come by. It's not like in the early period where there's a sheet and someone has to have saved it for some reason. They're in newspapers. They're, very easy to produce these images. And if you think about like Puck magazine or Judge magazine, that had these big color cartoons often in the middle of those magazines that were detailed and biting and clever enough that, like Boss Tweed, the figure of Boss Tweed, this sort of big-bellied, corrupt politician comes from, I believe, Thomas Nast and some of those magazines. That's a period that's a real high point of cartoons cutting, but also just in and of themselves, really impressive to look at. Mm-hmm. They're actually, in researching this morning, I came across a fact which I loved, and I could not find the cartoon I wanted to use it, but I will toss this out there for those who might use it in teaching. The idea of the donkey being associated with the Democratic Party, it begins to be used against Jackson when he runs for president in 1828. And he does what so many people do, the same thing that Americans did when they were accused of being Yankee, these crude Yankees, and Yankee Doodle was a song made to insult them. And the Americans were like, oh yeah, we take that song. We own that song. Jackson ended up taking the donkey as a symbol, saying, yeah, I'm very stable. I'm very straightforward. I'm very stubborn. I don't give way, so he sort of took that over. So I can't say definitively that beginning in 1828, they were associated, but there are very early cartoons, like 1834 or 1835, in which you see, I think there's an 1835 one that shows Jackson riding on a donkey. So that's around the time that idea begins, and it begins logically enough in a political cartoon.
Excellent. So Catherine wants to know, who are the readers? Who's the audience for these cartoons? Is it mostly men? Is it landowners? Or were more average people and working class people reading them too?
Well, if they're being sold in the street, I mean, first of all, let's say they were a penny or 2 pennies. The average person is not necessarily going to be wanting to, hand over money. So I can't say that everyone has ready access to it, but they're out there. The image is out there, right? So people can certainly see it. I don't think it's just for an elite audience, but I also think depending on the image, there are some people who would understand the bubbles coming out of the mouth and other people who really would not. So I think they're intended for a not just a handful of elite guys audience, but there's probably also an assumption that unless the image, and this is maybe one of the reasons why the images are so ripe, an image, a ripe, very obvious, crude image is going to make a point that you don't need words. Like a picture of Washington on a guillotine, Washington, monarchism, that's going to be really clear. So it depends on the cartoon, but it was certainly not just a super elite audience that would have been looking at these cartoons.
Excellent. Kathleen wants to know, how effective are cartoons on making a political impact on various individuals? Did they ever cause someone to win or lose an election or cause some other change? And my camera's going to go off for just a second. I'll let you answer that.
Hey, well, and part of the answer to that is I don't know concretely if that is true. I know certainly, and I see someone in chat mentioned Doonesbury. There have certainly been moments when cartoons captured something about a moment or a candidate. Is it Dan Quayle who in Dewsbury was represented by a feather? That he only, whenever he appeared, all that you got was a feather. I can't even remember, but there are some cartoons that I can't say like, and this shaped the outcome, but certainly it made a pretty obvious point and about a politician, and that stuck, right? That pulled on something that some people thought, but gave it an image. I'm trying to see if people, no one's commented on that, but I think it was Dan Quayle who was represented by just like a little floating feather. There was nothing there. So yeah, I think, as Catherine is saying, it's hard to prove that a cartoon won or lost something, but you can say at various moments that a cartoon affects popular culture. That it spreads in popular culture, and that's another reason to create and spread cartoons, right? Is to sway public opinion in one way or another, and sometimes an image might be able to do that really effectively. So I can't draw the direct line, but were cartoons helpful in swaying public opinion in electoral contests? I would assume some were, because as I said throughout my commentary, they can be really powerful.
And actually, Tom wants to mention just two specifically, if you would like to speak to either one of them. He's mentioning Alter to Gallic Despotism in the 1800 election, and Benjamin Franklin's Join or Die, and wonders if, in fact, that even counts as a cartoon. So either of those specifically you'd like to speak to?
Well, I thought about the Join or Die cartoon with the snake divided into pieces. I couldn't decide if I wanted to call that a cartoon or not, and so I didn't mention it. It could be. You could say that's cartoon. It's making a pretty obvious point. It gets picked up and it gets repeated over and over and over again. I think because I was kind of looking at things that were using satire or humor to slash at politics, because I wanted to connect these cartoons to social media memes. I didn't start there, but you could definitely make an argument that that's a really early American political cartoon.
Interesting. And thank you, Tom, for those excellent examples. More things for everybody to research. All right. So Beth says, do political cartoons blur the line between satire and propaganda?
Oh, interesting. Well, and does propaganda slur the line between images and cartoons, right? I mean, the first thing that pops into my mind is that very famous Boston Massacre image by Paul Revere, in which it represents a point of view. It's not a cartoon, it's an image, but people might claim it was propaganda since it was expressing a point of view. I mean, there are different versions of that image, which is worth knowing if you're teaching in class. But at least one of them, shows the sort of bloodthirsty British and Americans lying in the street. And it's really making a point of view, saying something powerful about the British in that particular moment and the Americans as victims. I don't want to get into a discussion, maybe another episode of Now and Then about propaganda and what counts as propaganda and what it does. I might actually very much come back to that. I might even think about it and have an early topic for next week.
There you go.
I know,
Sweet.
it'd be shocking. But I think as with so many components of politics that are using culture to shape political outcomes, that the line between humor and propaganda can be blurred. I think sometimes it's not blurred and it's really obvious. But I think sometimes it might be a little blurry. And I think that's another reason why that kind of mode of political fighting is useful, right?
Mm-hmm.
We see it all the time with words. Someone will say something some politician will say something really offensive. And when they're called on it, they'll say, it's a joke. Don't you have a sense of humor? Same idea, right? You said this, well, it's a cartoon. It's humor. I'm not really saying that. It's like, well, yeah, but you actually did say it and you put that out into the world. So whether you want to claim it's a joke or not, it's out there. So that's an interesting distinction. And I don't think there's necessarily a very clear line in the sand about that.
Interesting. Yeah, it's just a great thinking question, Beth. Thank you.
It is. That's a great question.
Yeah. So Clinton is wondering about the difference between cartoons that are directed toward people in the know instead of towards the general public. And I hope I'm understanding exactly the way you want this presented, Clinton. But I suppose the difference between cartoons that are swaying people in power versus swaying the voting public, or are there other differences in audience? How are cartoons drawn differently or presented differently depending on that audience and who needs to be convinced?
Well, I mean, and I once again am speaking off the top of my head. I think part of the answer for that would be yes, that there are different cartoons that have different levels of sophistication and wording in them, maybe making a point in one or another way. The reason why I say that is there was a magazine that came out in the late 1850s, I think 1858, called Vanity Fair, which is not related to the current Vanity Fair. And it was a humor magazine, but it has a lot of anti-congressional humor. They make fun of Congress all the time. The first image of Vanity Fair magazine shows two congressmen throwing things at each other in the House or Senate, and they're throwing like weapons and small animals and podiums and everything else. And that's like the first issue, Vanity Fair. And what struck me about that is that there was an ongoing feature in Vanity Fair that actually relates to this question, in which someone would go through that week's congressional debates and commentary, the congressional record. And the congressional record, there were huge parts of debate published in newspapers all over the place. So people could actually, and did actually often know what was going on in Congress in one way or another. Someone would go through that week's debates, that week's record, and pull out particular lines that were either funny or easy to make fun of. And they would string them together and create this really farcical moment in Congress. And the only way you could understand that is if you understood each moment that each line referred to. It's the most insider form of humor. Even I was like, oh, I think that refers to Joshua Giddings when he said this, someone referred to on the floor of Congress, talked about congressmen going backwards and forwards at the same time or something. And there became, in the Vanity Fair, it became, the great Democratic circus. So somehow or other, you would not find something funny unless you knew somehow in one way or another what was going on in the congressional record. So although, that magazine was sort of out in the world, it would have a relatively elite audience because it's a magazine. I suppose it would be a little bit costly. But the assumption, the level of assumption about knowledge and the people looking at it, to me, was really interesting. It really emphasized something that certainly is true about the 19th century, which is that people were far more tuned in to Congress and what it was doing than they were necessarily tuned in to all of the ins and outs of the presidency. It's over time that the presidency took as much of a center stage as it has today. The newspapers were mostly full of congressional news for a big chunk of the 19th century.
Well, thank you. That's fascinating. And but you really know your cartoons. Um, when you're giving, again, just because we do have some educators out there, and again, for those of us who are looking at historical cartoons or even modern cartoons, are there steps you tell students they should take? What advice do you give students who are learning how to analyze an image, who haven't really done that before? What are the first things we look for? Are there things to write down, things to note?
Well, that's a really good question. And I suppose part of the answer relates to what I was talking about last time with decoding a letter. You want to note when the cartoon came out, what happened around the time it came out, and thus probably that will give you some sense of what the cartoon is supposed to say. It'll relate to something controversial that just happened or something that wasn't controversial, but this person thought it should be. So you want to place it in time in a specific way. Obviously, in the same way that you want to read closely a letter, unfortunately, if it's early American, you're going to want to read those unfortunate word bubbles very closely. You're going to want to get a sense of what's being said and the words that are being used to say it, particularly given the ripeness of some of this humor. It becomes interesting what word choice and what imagery is actually put out there in a public way like this. So I would say using it in a classroom, I might start with, what does this image communicate to you in a general way? So how does it make you feel, or what is it suggesting, or who's the bad guy in this image, or who's getting mocked, or whatever, and then kind of zoom in on, so when did it come out? So what was happening with those people? So what are the words in it? And then thus, what is this saying about what happened in American society at the time? You could really, you can, particularly some of these more complicated cartoons that are hard to grasp right off the top of your head, they're so rich that that they are great teaching tools. And again, particularly when they're a little bit ripe. It's not what people think any early American period would be like, right? Like it's a bunch of people, staid men in breeches or standing in Congress. They don't envision earlier moments in history as being human. And in a way, cartoons are a good way to drive that point home.
I completely agree with that. And I did just put in the chat, again, we like the Library of Congress. They do have an image analysis guide for teachers and again, for the rest of us, that kind of, it's a way of breaking that down. Pretty much everything that you said, the suggested questions that you can either ask yourself or ask students, because there really is a wealth of political cartoons out there that can be enjoyed. So we do hope that all of you spend the afternoon going down political cartoon rabbit holes.
It would be interesting if you do end up having a lesson using cartoons that way, if you do find a way to incorporate memes and pull them apart in that way, as a way for students to understand things that are being said with images in a similar kind of a way, that would be really fascinating. I know a number of colleagues who have had students create memes, but having people decode them could be in conjunction with other cartoons would be really interesting.
Well, again, the tools of a historian are always relevant and useful in modern life. So
indeed, why
history matters, among other things.
History matters. I see people getting bingo all over the place. Okay, so I see people are, gosh, you guys, I'm like saving the chat over and over and over again because you have such good stuff in there.
We'll put it in the Slack this week.
Excellent. I want to, as always, thank everyone for coming. Even though some of us had a hard time beaming in because of a technical problem with the website, in the end, a lot of you got in here, and I'm very glad, because my PowerPoint show and tell thing, like, it didn't go horribly. And
can't believe you've never done a PowerPoint before. It's amazing.
No, I was like, how put imaging PowerPoint, like right before. Oh, insert picture. I can do that. But at any rate, thank you all for coming. Thank you all, the educators, for coming and talking about this moment in that context. Thank you for everyone who isn't necessarily an educator for coming and engaging in this kind of conversation that is the oomph of what makes democracy go, public debate about what's going on around you and what it means and why it's important. I will magically come up with a topic, and maybe it'll be propaganda next week, and hopefully I'll come up with it before Thursday. I hope you will join me then, and have a wonderful week. Those of you who, we are now going to go to the after party. And what that means is we will turn off recording so that we will have a little bit more freedom, to be a little freer and easier in our conversation. if you have beamed in online through the NCHE website, or through, I guess, my Twitter link or whatever, however you got in here, if you didn't come in through Facebook, you can stay right here. And as I always say, someone's going to get bingo. Poof, you will be in the after party, and we will just continue that for a while. If you are on Facebook and want to join the after party, you need to leave Facebook, and hopefully it's working now. Join us by going to ncheteach.org/conversations, and you will be able to join in with the rest of us for the after party. Everybody have a really good week. Stay warm for those of you who are being stormed on. Stay safe to everybody, and I will see you soon.
Thank you, Joanne. This was wonderful. And ncheteach.org does seem to be back up and going. So yes, join us there for the after party. And again, just a reminder that our conference is coming up March 17th through 20th. So do make sure you, again, go to our website and sign up for that. And the event that we've just announced today will be March 19th at 8 o'clock Eastern. We will be having History Matters and So Do Cocktails with Joanne to celebrate her 100th episode. So do join us for that. All right. And with that, we will see you all in the after party.
Okay, we're now going to have the poof moment. I'm just saving the chat.